This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know.
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
You know, and you thought your job was the pits. I mean, how would you like to be a cat herder, all right? And it may be, we probably got some teachers in here this morning. You feel like that's what you do all day, every day is you herd cat. Even I feel that way sometimes. When it's elder staff meeting time, it's like herding cats, y'all. I'm here to tell you right now. So let me ask you, the question behind all that is this. How do you feel about your job? How do you feel, and back behind that, how do you feel about work just in general? I apologize, by the way, for the technological demons that we have. We've only got one screen operating this morning, so I hope that you were able to see that. But the real, even more importantly, is here's the question. How do you feel about your job? How do you feel about work? I've heard the expression before that if you do what you love, you'll never go to work a day in your life. You ever heard that? If you do what you love, you'll never have to go to work a day in your life. I put that in the same category with sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's in the baloney file, you know. Because I love my job, but sometimes work is work, right? Sometimes it really is. So I want to ask you again, how do you feel about your work on this Labor Day weekend? How do you feel about your job? And that's a pretty important question for us, especially living in this country, because according to studies, Americans on average work a whole lot more than any other group of people in any industrialized nation. We spend a large part of our lives working. So how do you feel about it? How does it look? How does that all happen? Now, I tell you what I did. I went and looked at several little sources to just kind of get a feel for what was going on in America, in the workplace, where people, not just right here in Houston, Texas, but all over the world, kind of all over the country, how they were feeling about that. Because the last time I'd really looked at that was back in a book that was written back in the 70s by Studs Terkel. It's called Work. You ought to do yourself a favor. It's a good book. And he comes up with this definition. He says, work is violence. It's violence against the spirit. It's violence against your psyche. It's violence against your soul. All that he says about work is that it's violent. So I wanted to kind of take a peek and sort of see where it was now. So I went to several sites, and one of the sites I went to was the Huffington Post, simply because, and I'm not a big fan of Huffington Post, but it had a survey, a study that it had done. It was dated July of 2013, and it was looking at what's the biggest complaints about work. Well, what's the big stuff? And in that report, in that news report, it talked about a survey that was done by Gallup. And anything that Gallup does is pretty statistically significant, all right? And it asked the question, are you engaged with your work? And they defined engaged as being, number one, passionate about going to work, and number two, do you see your job, do you see yourself as being connected to something larger than just the paycheck? See yourself connected to something larger than just what you do. Maybe it's to the firm or the company or to values or whatever it might be, but that's the engaged person. They're passionate about what they do, and they're engaged. And it asked, are you engaged? Now, I was surprised at the response to that. How many people do you think are engaged with their work? Anybody, just anybody. What do you think the number was? What is that? Less than 10%. Somebody said that in first, sir. You're just sort of a negative guy today. I mean, you must have to work tomorrow. You don't have tomorrow off. That's what it is. You're feeling bitter about it. All right. No. Well, it's higher than that, but it shocked me. It was 30% of the American workforce feels engaged. That's less than 1 in 3. Less than 1 in 3 people feel passionate about what they do and see a larger picture, feel themselves to be connected to something larger than themselves. Those are two things that Stephen Jobs, and he's not the end-all guru on that stuff, but he's the guy that says you got to have those two items in place if you're going to be personally successful. You got to have that there. What's your biggest complaint about work? You look at all kinds of things on the internet, all kinds of surveys that are done, and a lot of them have a lot of the same stuff. But there was one connected with ABC News, and it made reference to a blog called the Wounded Worker blog by a fellow named Rosner. And a couple of years ago, he did his own online survey, his own online kind of thing that he was about doing, asking, what's your biggest complaint? And he was ready for the kind of stuff that you would expect to hear, low pay and disrespect, I'm not really respected, or poor working conditions, whatever that might be. He was prepared. But he wasn't prepared for the number one answer. In fact, he said over 50% of his responders had this answer as their number one complaint about work. You're not going to guess it. You want to guess? No, you're not going to guess this. People stealing your lunch. It would be a downer, wouldn't it? I mean, sometimes it's the little things that make it all that big a deal. And he told a story in there about somebody that reported they'd brought chicken wings to work. And somebody got in and stole their lunch. But here's what they did. They ate about half of the chicken wings. And they took the bones and stacked them back inside the container neatly and resealed it. Yeah, not just all. That's gross too, isn't it? Here's the thing. There was something that began to emerge through that. And I don't know how many of those things that I looked at. And there were two answers that were just on just about every single one. And if they weren't number, like 3 and number 5 or whatever, they were always in the top 10. Most of the time they were in the top 5. It may be worded different ways depending upon which one I looked at. But here were two things, two huge things, two big things. In fact, in the Huffington Post this one was number 1. Here's number 1. I hate my job. Now, that's kind of tough, isn't it? I mean, because you spend so much of your life. I hate my job. And here was the other one. I don't really know what I'm doing here. Now, that may be connected to the fact you just hadn't heard enough from the boss, right, to know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. But there's something kind of nomadic and haunting about that to me. So I want you to have those two things in mind, whether you thought that or felt that or not, but have those two things in mind as we turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, all right? And if you were here last week, you said, we were in Ecclesiastes last week. We were. We were talking about connection last week and being connected with each other. And over the last several weeks, we've been talking about that. And you guys have really responded well to that. I think some things are really going to be kind of happening in some of your lives as a result of that. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Same book, but a whole totally different subject. Ecclesiastes. Now, I want you to know something about the book of Ecclesiastes. I want you to know what the whole overall thing is about this book. All right, the whole overall, what he's trying to communicate. See, the book of Ecclesiastes is really a journal. Today we would call it a blog. It's a blog that Solomon wrote, a king in Israel, wrote 3,000 years ago about life. And you may think 3,000 years ago, what connection does that have to do with right now? Let me tell you what, life has not really changed, and that's one of his big theses. Life doesn't really change. We got a lot more stuff than they ever thought about having. We got more stuff in our designer jeans than Solomon ever thought about having in all of his glory. You know what I'm saying? But life is basically the same. Got the same kind of pattern. You live, you grow up, you get married, you have a job, you get old, and you die, and then it starts all over again. And so there's kind of what life is. And so he's writing this blog, and here's what he's trying to figure out. This God-inspired blog. He's trying to figure out, answer this question, is there anything in life that's really worthwhile? Out of all the things that comprises life, is there anything that really makes it meaningful outside of this repetitive cycle? That's a pretty haunting question, and I will tell you, Solomon's not the only person to raise that question. Lots of folks have raised that question. And maybe you felt it. Maybe you never raised it to the level of your lips, but it's kind of down in there. What makes it meaningful? And his process, as he goes through this thing, his process is to look at all the different parts, components that make up life, and analyze them and determine if they add anything to the meaning of life, to the significance of life. So he talks about things like IQ. He doesn't use the word IQ, but he talks about intelligence. Is life more meaningful for intelligent people than it is for not so intelligent people? And he talks about pleasure. Does that bring meaning to life? And he talks about wisdom. Does that bring meaning to life? And he talks about things like work. And work is probably the subject that he talks about the most. He talks about it, and then he comes back to it, and then he talks about it some more, and then he talks about something else, and he comes back to it again. But he talks about work probably more than anything else. Does work bring meaning to life? And I just want you to kind of answer that in your own mind. I'm not looking for a survey or a show of hands. I just want you to think, does work make life meaningful? You may say, well, it depends on the work and all that sort of thing. Well, let's see what Solomon says. In fact, he kind of lays out. He says, this is what I'm about. It's a God-inspired journal that tries to address the issue, is there anything to human existence, anything meaningful to human existence? So he's talking about life, but he's talking about all these other things as well. And the thing we're interested in is work. And he lays this out. If you look at chapter 2 in the last half of verse 3, he says, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Well, what did he come up with? Let's cut to the chase. What did he come up with? Well, if you look at the opening words of his journal, and this starts in verse 2. Actually, verse 1, he's just giving his credentials. He's identifying himself. In verse 1, he says he's the teacher, as we said last week, the Hebrew word koheleth. But he's also a king in Israel, and he is a king in Jerusalem, and he's a son of David. No serious scholar denies the fact that it's Solomon that probably put the majority of all of this together. And then verse 2, he begins the blog. He begins the journal. And here's what he says. Seatbelts buckled? Here's what he says. Meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. How do you feel about that? You know what? I have an allergy to general, extreme statements. I mean, I want to say everything is totally devoid of meaning. There's no significant thing in human. Everything is meaningless? Are you just saying that for a fact? I mean, I want to say, come on. But then I consider the source, and he's the smartest guy that ever lived, right? Up until Jesus or outside of Jesus Christ, he's the smartest guy that ever lived. And if anybody would have the tools to examine that issue, it'd be Solomon. I mean, he was unparalleled. Human life is basically the same, and he's inspired by God. So I got a tendency to kind of listen to this. Everything is meaningless? What in the world are you talking about? Let's kind of get into this a little bit. We're not going to read every verse, okay? But you see what this thing is, where it's going, what it's all about. He starts off in chapter 2 and verse 4, and he gives us his resume. He talks about his own work history, so we'll know really from experience how qualified he might be. He says in verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, and I planted vineyards, and I made gardens and parks, and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. It makes you wonder, how many jobs can a guy have in a single lifetime, besides being king of Israel, right? During its golden age years. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. And then he begins to talk about kind of how his work paid off, if it was successful or not. He said, well, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. And he goes on to talk about the kind of entertainment that he had. And he goes on to talk about women. That's one of the things, pleasure is one of the things that he examines. And if any male ought to know about women in the history of male kind, it ought to be Solomon, right? How many wives and concubines did he have? Does anybody know? What is that? Yeah, well, somewhere in that neck of the woods, right? I mean, and he talks about in chapter 2, he had a harem on top of all of that. But the main thing he's focusing on is this work business. And so he says this in verse 10 of chapter 2, and you don't have that. I changed this up a little bit since I gave my slides to Van, and Van's out of town. But here's what he says in about the middle of verse 10. He said, my heart took delight in all my work. And this was the reward for all my labor. And I want you to think about that just for a minute, because he says something kind of significant here. He says, first off, my heart took delight in all my work. He's talking about just that natural sense of achievement that you have when you do your job, whatever it is. Whether you're raking the leaves because they need to be raked, and finally your spouse says, I'm not going to talk to you about it anymore, that sense of whatever. Whether it's raking leaves or you're working in the Pentagon, whatever it might be, there's a sense of accomplishment. There's a sense of well-being about doing your job. You know what I'm talking about. Everybody in here has felt that. Whether you like work or don't like work, everybody in here has felt that. But now look at the second part of that phrase. And this was the reward for all my labor. In fact, I want you to think about how he said that if he were speaking here, his emphasis. I think he would say, and this was the reward for all my labor. I mean, at the end of the day, here it is. The only thing you can say about work, and really any of the other things that he talks about, is the only reward for work is that sense of satisfaction. Because, verse 11, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. Chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Now, what are you kind of feeling in your gut here? How many of you thought, oh boy, this is what we're going to talk about today? You feel good about this? Why would he say that? Well, he gives two reasons in verses 12 through 16, and we're not going to. You can look through that if you want to. You got your text open, but he gives basically two reasons, and one of the reasons is that because there's not anything new to do. Because life, yes, it changes. We live in a different day and time now, as I said a moment ago, but it's really basically the same thing. And there's not anything that you're going to do that's going to break that generational kind of cycle. Because the day is coming for you and me, right? That's it. And it's that last little piece of that generational cycle that gives him reason number two. It's meaningless because we die. We die. Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher, it galled him to no end that we would be beings that could dream and imagine and create and that we would just all die. So he says in verse 17, I hated life. Man. I hated life. Why? Because the work that's done under the sun was grievous to me. It was all a burden. Really, you get back and you look on it, all the things that you do and contribute, it's burdensome. All of it's burdensome because all of it's meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, and look at how he describes death, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether he'll be a wise man or a fool. You work hard all of your life to leave it to some dumb bunny who's got no idea what you went through? That's right. Amen, Brother Solomon. What's up with that? He says, this is meaningless. So my heart, verse 20, began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. A man may do his work with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and then leave all he owns to someone who hadn't worked for it? This is meaningless and a great misfortune. And then he raises the question. Here's the question, verse 22. What do you get for all that hard work? What do you get? What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? Verse 23 is the answer. Pain and grief. So now how are you feeling? All his days his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This is so meaningless. And we all know about laying awake at night because you're worried about work. Right? Am I the only one that does that? Me and Solomon? Are we the only ones that do that? All of that to come to this? Really? Now look, before you go in Tuesday morning and quit your job and liquidate your 401k and buy a motorcycle and drive to live the rest of your life in Margaritaville, before you do that, I want you to understand something about Solomon's approach. Brilliant. It's brilliant. Solomon is talking about perspective. He talks about two main perspectives in this book. All right? There's a little bit more than that, but two primarily. And one of the perspectives, and by the way, perspective means everything. Perspective means everything because perspective is how you look at stuff. And how you look at stuff depends upon where you stand, right? Well, from where I stand, I see. You ever heard that expression? That's perspective. Everything depends on where you stand. Everything depends on where you stand. Everything. Have you ever wondered how so many people can see the same thing and people walk away with totally different opinions about what actually happened? It depends on perspective, right? That's exactly what it depends on. And I've said this before, but I want to say it again because it's really important. I want to tell you where I stand. Here's my testimony to you at second service this morning. Here's where I stand. I stand at the mouth of an empty tomb. And it has changed everything. Not only has it changed what I do, it changes the way I do it. Everything depends upon perspective. Now, so far, all he's talked about is what I'm going to call the face value perspective. Life without the concept or without the notion of God. That when it's over, we're like Rover, we're dead all over. Right? And he's saying purely from that standpoint, from that soul perspective, this is meaningless. Jean-Paul Sartre was absolutely right. This is meaningless. And the only end result of that kind of... Some people say life is justification in and of itself. You ever heard that? Who needs God? Life justifies life. You ever heard that? That life is good and life is full. So life justifies life. Well, say that to somebody that has cerebral palsy. Really? Man, that's enough for you? Are we that dense? The only end result of that viewpoint is despair, and Solomon expresses it well. That's the only end conclusion. I've told you before about Friedrich Nietzsche, though they didn't seem to remember it at first service, so maybe I haven't. Friedrich Nietzsche, have I ever told you about him, a philosopher? He's the most influential dead philosopher in America today. Back in the 60s, this idea began to go around. It came from Friedrich Nietzsche. God is dead. You ever heard that particular brand? God is dead. Friedrich Nietzsche came up with that. Nietzsche said that life, yes, there was a God at one time. You can't explain creation without that. There's just no way to come to terms with the fact that we're all here and we're here as we are here without the notion that there was a God. But something has happened, he said. God is no longer there. Something happened to God. God died somewhere along the way, and now we're beginning to see and feel what the end result of all of that is. He's dead. He says, look into the universe. I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but he said, look into the universe, and you'll see coldness, and you'll feel coldness. And then he said, look at it more deeply. Doesn't it feel colder? And you know what happened to Friedrich Nietzsche? You know what happened to him? He went nuts. And I don't know, maybe it's deja vu. I feel like I've shared this with you before, but here you are, I'm kind of in the middle of it now. So here it is. He was touring Italy or Spain, one of those countries, and he passed by a guy who was beating his donkey out in a field. And he told the driver to stop, and he walks out, tears running down his cheeks, and he shoves the man away, and he throws his arms around that donkey, and he says, don't beat him anymore. He's my brother. And everybody kind of pushed their hats back and said, Fred, you want to think about that again before you? He spent the last 10 years of his life in a padded cell. That's the end result of that viewpoint. That's the one perspective that he's presented so far. But there's another perspective. It's the God perspective. That everything is the hands of God. And everything, even though it may seem purposeless and repetitive and all those guys, there's a purpose in that. God made it. That's the God viewpoint. The faith viewpoint. And he says it's a whole another perspective. Now I want you to notice something. If you've got your text open and you're looking in the NIV where it breaks it down into paragraphs, there's a paragraph change between verse 23 and verse 24. See that in there? Up to verse 23, he's talking about this face-only kind of perspective. Verse 24 is not just a paragraph shift, it's a perspective shift. And he gives us the other viewpoint. Because look at what he says in verse 24. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. Why? Only one reason, only one answer. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. This cycle, this stuff, that we work and that all those things are there, that's God's design. God's doing a purpose with all of that. But he says, let me tell you that at the end of the day, find satisfaction in that. Because there's a reason to it. And God reveals that reason. He says there's no way to grasp it, no way to come to terms with anything in life, much less work, without that perspective. And so he says in verse 25, because without Him, who can eat or even find enjoyment? You know why? Because it all comes to nothing. Now, let's pause here just for a second and put a peg down. Here's the first little deal that he's going to tell you. He's going to tell us three basic things about work in the book of Ecclesiastes. And here's the first one, culminating in verses 24 and 25 here, chapter 2. You got to embrace the God perspective, or it's not going to make sense. You wind up bitter, and the older you get, the more disgruntled you become. You have to embrace the God perspective. All right? And the God perspective, and just if I can refine that and just talk about work just for a second, the God perspective is you were created to enjoy life, and you were created to enjoy work, and work is God's gift to you. Yeah, but I herd cats every day. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you do. Perspective doesn't come from what you do. Embrace the perspective, and everything changes. And the problem with us is that we forget that perspective. And when you forget that perspective, you know what your job becomes? Your job becomes, in any job, it becomes a treadmill. You got a treadmill in mind? What do you do on a treadmill? You work and you work and you work, and where do you go? Nowhere. And life will start to feel that way just about that quick if you lose sight, if you fail to embrace that perspective. You hear what I'm saying? Now, treadmills, where do you find them? Usually you find them in gyms, right? Air-conditioned gyms, or maybe an air-conditioned room in your house. So you go back there, you're going to take off a few pounds, or you're going to, get life in shape, and it lasts for 15 minutes or so, and, then you're... But treadmills have been around a lot longer than that. In fact, they were around in Victorian England. And you didn't find them in air-conditioned gyms. Number one, they didn't have air conditioning. Number two, they didn't have gyms. You know where you found them? They weren't called treadmills, they were called tread wheels. You know where you found them? In prisons. And they put their prisoners on this treadmill. So here he would go, most of his day or her day spent on the treadmill, working, and going nowhere as they paid their debt to society. They would hook it up with little belts and whatever to a system that would transport water through the prison or grind up meal or whatever it might be, but basically going nowhere. That is Solomon's end point for the godless perspective. And if you forget it, you get there the same way. I want to tell you, it doesn't matter what you do. God's will is that we work, and His plan is that we enjoy that. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do, because that enjoyment and satisfaction does not come from the job. It comes from the perspective. Now, here's the second thing I want us to take home. And building upon that foundation, Solomon moves forward. I want you to jump ahead to chapter 9 just for a moment, and I want you to look at verse 10. Incredible verse there. It's one of the most famous verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. But look at chapter 9, verse 10. What does it say? Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Don't just go to work Tuesday morning. Go with a vengeance. Do it with all your might. There's some sort of something that comes from that. I think verse 10 of chapter 1 really is informative right there. The delight of work. I mean, there it is. Whatever you do it with all your might. Stick with it. Get after it. Go do it. Man, you talk about a life that begins to transform with that kind of perspective. There it is. I want you to go back with me just for a second to 1983. And let's move over to Australia. And we're going to take a peek at the 1983 Australian Ultra Marathon. How many people have ever heard of that? World famous, not too many runners in here. We had a few in first service. It is a foot race, 573 7/10 miles long. You heard me right. 573.7 miles, a foot race. You don't measure that in hours, you measure that in days, right? There it is. It's a track that runs from Sydney, Australia to Melbourne, Australia. And if you look you look that up on your internet and you look at a map, one map I saw said, it had the map there says, "Welcome to hell." I get that, don't you? 1983. You got runners, pros, and amateurs from all over the world. They're descending on Sydney, Australia. They're going to begin this race. And it's the day the race begins. And you got all these runners with these sculpted bodies and all their stuff going on, and their sponsors and everything happening here. All the stuff going on, hoopla everywhere. The Australian Ultra Marathon. And up walks a guy in overalls. And that's because he's a potato farmer and a sheep herder. That's what he does for a living. He's in overalls. And he has what Australians call gumboots. Anybody know what a gumboot is? Yeah, we call them galoshes. He had that over his boots. He walks up to the to the sign-up place and says, "I want a number." Well, the guys behind the table thought this was some kind of joke. They said, "There's no way." And they're looking for the cameras around here. This is fun. This is ha ha ha. And Cliff Young said, 61 years old. Did I tell you that part? 61 years old. He says, no. He says, "I want to enter the race." So they gave him a number, pinned it to his overalls. He goes to the starting lineup. What do you think the crowd's doing? I mean, they're laughing, they're snickering. They see this guy walking up and say, this is not even for real. And you imagine what happened when the gun goes off and everybody takes off with these, here they go, they're doing all of their stuff down here, and here goes, he had a shuffle. They call it the Cliff Young shuffle in retrospect. Here he goes, shuffling across, and he's on this race. They started laughing out loud, and runners can get kind of serious sometimes. Finally, one of them said, "Get that old fool off the track." Let me tell you about Cliff Young. 5 days, 14 hours, and 4 minutes later, he crosses the finish line. 1:25 in the morning. He finally crossed it. A lot to be said for perseverance. A lot to be said for giving it all you got, right? By the way, I want you to know, he was not the last one to cross the finish line. In fact, let me tell you the whole story. He was the first one to cross the finish line. And I don't mean barely first. Number 2 was 9 hours and 56 minutes behind him. You think I'm making this stuff up? You can't make this stuff up. And everybody wondered, what's going on? The paparazzi was all over that 1:25 in the morning. Said, "What's this guy see?" We know it's not his shoes. What is it? They started going through his bag. What did he eat that was filled with pumpkin seeds and water? Now, I've seen videos. He's drinking some sort of concoction. I guess they give to every runner through the deal. I see him in one deal where he's drinking that, and he's kind of talking as he shuffles along. The Cliff Young shuffle. Look him up on the internet as he kind of does this thing. He comes in. Not only did he come in first, y'all, he set a new ultramarathon world record. What was the secret? They finally discovered what it was. He never slept. Most of the guys would run 18 hours a day, and then they would take some time off, and they would sleep for 3 or 4 hours. He never slept. And when you look at pictures of this guy, lots of those sites, you'll hear quotes, you'll hear him saying things where he says, "Never quit, never give up, always stay with it." It sounds just like Solomon. Now, I've got to give you a caution. Listen to Solomon's advice. Go to work, work hard, but listen to his full piece of advice. Don't overwork. I want you to look at verse 10 again of chapter 9 and realize it's in a context about this long. It starts in verse 7. And in the context, he says, go, and what does he say? Not saying anything about work. What's he saying? He's saying, go, eat your food with gladness, drink your wine with a joyful heart. Enjoy your life. For it is now that God favors what you do. All you have is right now. Enjoy every aspect of life. Always be clothed in white. Always anoint your head with oil. It's not a matter of comfort. It's a matter of just enjoy everything you are. In fact, he says in verse 9, take out a little time for romance. Enjoy life with your wife whom you love. All the days of the meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. Verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, you do it with all your might. Now remember, work is a priority. It's not the priority. It's not God. So that leads us to the third. What's Solomon's first little thing here? Embrace the God perspective. Number 2, listen to his advice. Work, but work's not everything, right? And then here's number 3. Remember your priority. Remember the priority in life. Here's how he comes down. He concludes the entire book. This really is the most famous part of Ecclesiastes, verses 13 and 14 of chapter 12. Now all has been heard. My blog is over. My research is done. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Everything is transformed. No. Everything changes if that's true. By the way, you know how I know it's true? Because the tomb is empty. That's how I know. Now, you don't have to go out and just kill yourself with this thing. I want you to take a look at your screen just for a minute. You know who this is up on the screen? Anybody know who that is? Yeah, that's Jimmy Stewart. And that's one of his most famous roles. Does anybody know what role that is? Who's the character here? Yeah, George Bailey. Some of y'all have seen the Frank Capra classic, It's a Wonderful Life, right? How many of you seen that movie? Let me see. Yeah. There he is. And this is a part of the movie where he's talking to Mary. He says, Mary, I know what I'm going to do tomorrow and the next day and the next year and the year after that. Did you hear that? I'm going to leave this little town far behind and I'm going to see the world. Italy and Greece, the Parthenon, the Colosseum. Then I'm coming back here and I'll go to college and I'll see what they know. And then I'm going to build things. I'm going to build airfields, and I'm going to build skyscrapers 100 stories high, and I'm going to build bridges a mile long. Now, here's the deal about that. George Bailey was wrong about all of it. He didn't do any of that stuff. You know what he did tomorrow, and the day after that, and the year after that? Same thing he did the day before, and the day before that. God's will for him was an ordinary life. Right? It's extraordinary, the glory that comes from just an ordinary life that tends to business, that sees from the perspective of God, that works as God calls us to work. I want to tell you that there's extraordinary blessing that comes from all of that. Just being ordinary people in our cycle, during our time here on this earth. Amen? Father, we are grateful to you because you have made a wondrous thing here. Now, just like Solomon, Father, we still have questions about stuff. We do. And that'll not all be settled, I guess. But the big things are settled. Thank you for the empty tomb that verifies everything we read in that book. That drives it home. No wonder Jesus said, how blessed are those that didn't actually see me, but believe through the testimony of your prophets, of your apostles, of your people. Father, I ask that you'd help us to be people that show the world what you can do with folks that really, really trust in you. Not just in the job that we do, but how we do it, how we live it. Thank you, Father, for every good thing that you give us. We love you in Jesus' name, and amen. Can we serve you in any way? Let us know about it as we